And thank you for watching this video. I'm Laura Dougal, and this is my colleague and friend, Sarah Turner, and we're both maternity return coaches. And we're making this video today to introduce the topic for this month, which is around mental health and the link between mental health and maternity return coaching, and why we think that this is an important topic to talk about. So first of all, if I just sort of introduce the idea of mental health being as a continuum. So if we were to think that our mental health, at times in our lives we are thriving, and at times in our lives we're struggling, and there are times in our lives when we're sort of in the middle of that and surviving, and we could be at any point in that spectrum. And as coaches, what we're seeing is normally, people come to us as coaches when they're thriving, and it's looking at, this is all going well, what more could be done, what else could I do? But sometimes people come to us as coaches when they're in that middle part of surviving. So they're not struggling, they're not in the grip of a mental health illness, but they're in this point in the middle where it's sort of, something isn't quite right. Is there something more I could do? And Sarah and I, having talked about this at great length, would say that this is something we really recognise in maternity return coaching, is that it's not necessarily postnatal depression per se, it's not necessarily like diagnosable anxiety, but it's such a period of change that sometimes these things can come up where you can be feeling more anxious than usual. You might be feeling pressure or overwhelm. So that's where we sort of see our role as coaches coming in between this sort of part between surviving and thriving, where coaching can be the tool that helps you to raise awareness, even of where you are on that spectrum, and understanding a bit about yourself and what kind of things you might do or could put in place to support you. And we'll talk to that as we go through this video.
Yeah. And I think what comes up for me as I hear you describe that, Laura, is often I don't think we necessarily know where we are on that spectrum. We're just getting on with life, and particularly when you're a new mum, there's so much to juggle that you're probably just head down, just dealing with whatever's in front of you. And it might take a coaching session for you to maybe feel a little bit emotional, or to be sharing what's going on for you right now, and for the coach to listen and maybe reflect back some of what they're seeing and what they're hearing, for you to then realise, well, actually, maybe I'm finding this a little bit harder than perhaps I'd allowed myself to consider. And that's where we can play such a vital role, I believe, in really supporting our clients at what is a hugely transformational time in their lives.
Yeah.
So one of the things we wanted to just flag, and actually, we, in a way, a little bit surprised by the statistic. We thought it would be higher, but there's this fabulous report, and we can put this in the notes, that was shared quite recently, where they talked about how 11% of women suffer with mental illness as a direct result of their return to work and motherhood. And I think this is a really interesting statistic, because often when we think about mental health and mothers, we'll think of postnatal depression. And, I put my hands up, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. But, when I think of postnatal depression, I kind of think of new mum, tiny baby. It's those early days, those early weeks and months when you typically get the baby blues, or, it becomes something slightly more deeper and more serious. So if I just have a look at this, the baby blues is apparently kind of 3 to 10 days after you give birth. This is according to Mind. But postnatal depression is a much deeper and longer term depression that usually develops within 6 weeks of giving birth. It can be quite gradual, or it can be sudden. And it can range from being mild to very severe. But still, when I think of that definition, I'm thinking of maternity leave. I'm thinking of a woman off work with a tiny baby. My sense, my own personal experience, what I've seen in my work, is I think that actually, a mental health challenge, maybe not a serious challenge, but a sense of difficulty of being maybe in that surviving zone that you talked about, can really happen at any point. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. And it can be ongoing, and it becomes the normal, doesn't it? So we don't even recognise that we're in it. I shared with you just before this video that actually my daughter's 8 now, and I feel like I'm only just moving out of that surviving part, but not that I have had a mental health issue or illness. Like, nothing has been like drastically wrong. It's just that so much of my life has changed since having my daughter, that I've had to constantly rejig things and change how I, even the way that I work or some of the friendship groups. And, there's so much change that it can have an impact on, if one area of our lives is undergoing some sort of change and it impacts on another, and then we're sort of constantly juggling all the time. But yeah, it can just move into this part of our lives where we just think that's normal now. So
yeah. And I mean, just on the postnatal depression piece, before we move on, I thought this was quite interesting when I was looking into this, is you're more likely to experience postnatal depression or maternal related mental health if you've experienced it before, if you've had any kind of anxiety or depression during pregnancy, if you're lacking support from family and friends, and I do hear that quite a bit in my coaching, or if you've had a recent stressful event. So it could be the death of someone close to you, the end of a relationship, or the loss of your job. Those last two really stood out for me, because those are the sorts of things that I do pick up on in my coaching that might signal that someone is maybe in that surviving zone, maybe not in the really struggling zone, although sometimes it could be, where either that it's a couple who've started their family, maybe they're living a long way away from family and friends, and they're really on their own, or equally, I've also had examples of clients where they've returned to work and then they've lost somebody close to them, or they've returned to work and their actual job is unclear. What am I returning to? Ooh, my maternity cover has been made permanent. What does that mean for me? Or, oh, my line manager's not been particularly clear. I really don't know what I'm going back to, and I'm feeling really anxious about it.
Yeah, exactly. And you saying that just makes me think as well about how actually going through any kind of change, sometimes there's also a loss with that, isn't there? So even in like becoming a parent, you do lose the person that you were before. So there is something about grief. It might not just be about your job. It might not be about losing somebody close to you. It might be the grief of losing that sense of who I was before I had children, to make space for this new version of who I am now. And I guess the importance of, why we're recording this video, I suppose, is to help make that distinction between when you might need a therapist and when you might need a coach. Because I do think that there is still a bit of it's about mental health. It needs to be a psychotherapist or it needs to be a psychologist. And that isn't always the case, because that's where coaching can really help in that. If you're in that sort of mid-survival section, actually that is where coaching can support you. And you rightly said earlier as well, that even if you're in the struggling part of it, it might be that you work with a therapist alongside coaching as well. So there's a space for all of this kind of support. And actually sometimes working with a coach is the initial step to recognizing actually something's not quite right here, and then being flagged to other supports, which you might do separately or you might do alongside coaching as well.
Yeah, and I've definitely had examples of that. Not many, but I've had mothers who, in the coaching sessions, and I've just observed where they're at and kind of shared that with them, shared those observations with them, and kind of gently explored how are they really, and said it's okay not to be okay, and then encouraged them to go and seek additional support. And for some of them, just having someone name it for them, having someone say it's okay to feel how you're feeling, but don't go through this on your own. Who can you lean on? And for some of them, they have made that decision to go off and actually find a therapist and do that deeper work, which is great, because that's not going to be my skill set. And equally for others, it was just enough having that kind of flag to them for them to go and seek the support elsewhere, whether that's with their partner or talk to HR department or whatever it might be. And I think that's a really important role that we can play, of being that safe, confidential space where a woman can really be vulnerable in maybe a way that they might not be elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's that sometimes working with a coach, it might help to catch something before it gets to that part of struggling. And I'm just thinking of various examples if we took anxiety as a topic, for instance, and how that might be different working with a coach and working with a therapist. So I don't know about you, Sarah, but I definitely work with a lot of clients who are maybe, again, like if we use that term, like in the grip. So they're not in the grip of diagnosable anxiety. It's not like a generalized anxiety disorder per se, but there is like a sense of feeling on edge, or they've got so many plates that they're spinning, so many balls that they're juggling, and going back to work, this is a real like pinch point of a time where you're trying to figure out, like, how am I now looking after this child that I've been with through my maternity leave? Now I've got to factor in going back to work, I've got to factor in my partner and our relationship and expectations, and looking after myself, all of this. So it can build to a point of feeling anxious. And if that is left on its own, that then, if you think over time, that can lead to burnout and stress and become something else. Whereas if you're working with somebody like as a coach, at that time, you might be able to identify, actually, these are some of the things that I would do if I was recognizing in somebody, actually, it sounds like you're doing a lot and you're being stretched too thin. So using some reflection, being able to ask those questions about, like, let's take a typical week. What does it look like? Doing that sort of stepping back and being able to see, oh my gosh, I'm actually trying to squeeze so much into my week. Is that realistic? Would you expect someone else to be fitting that into their week? What do you think is going to happen if that continues, if that's how this carries on? And then being able to work through that as, okay, what other options are there? Does it have to be this way? What other support is available that you might just not have considered? It might just be sort of out of your line of vision because you're so busy doing all of this. So that's where I see, if we took anxiety as a topic, that's what it might look like to work with a coach. So we're sort of doing some preventative work, really, to stop you from moving into that part where it becomes something that you might then want to go and see a therapist for.
Absolutely, and it's almost quite practical, isn't it? It's really working in quite a practical way around, right, what are some of the strategies that you might want to put in place to support you? And I often describe it a little bit like scaffolding. When you're doing work on a house, you put scaffolding up. As you're navigating this change, you're coming back to work. Often it's first time as a working parent. It's a whole new world. Suddenly your days have gone from being elastic to being bookended because you've got to do the drop off and the pick up. There's a whole range of other things that you suddenly have to take responsibility for, which is all the plate spinning you're talking about. And so you're learning, like, how do I do this? And so actually it can really be around, well, let's think this through. How can you actually do this? What are some of the things? What are some of the steps that you might take? And one of the things I wanted to kind of pick up on here, you talked about anxiety there and this period of change. One of the exercises I'll often go through with the clients is to just encourage them to take a step back. Because often when you're in the thick of it, it does feel overwhelming and like difficult to cope. But actually, the most challenging time, and this is my own personal experience, obviously all people and all children are different, is when your baby is so small. So those first few years is often when it's most overwhelming. And so one of the exercises I'll do is I'll say, okay, let's draw a timeline. So today, how old are you? Maybe you're 35 and your baby is 1. Let's jump ahead 5 years to you being 40 and baby is 5. And then again, 45 and 10, and then 50 and 15. And we just pause each of those sort of landmarks and think about, what does that mean in terms of what the baby's going to need from you? And what does that mean in terms of you, what you're able to give your career, your partner, your child. And it just enables people to step back and go, okay, this might be tough now, but it's not going to be like that forever. The second thing around this exercise is it illustrates how it evolves over time. And you named that earlier when you talked about that kind of being in that surviving zone. You may well spend quite a substantial amount of time in surviving as a working parent, but there will also be times when you will be thriving. There may be times when you're struggling, all of which is okay, all of which is human.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it does move, and it might move that continuum. You might find yourself on Monday thriving, by Monday afternoon, you might be surviving, so it's just a constantly moving piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that really, this video is intended to be the start of this conversation around mental health, motherhood and maternity return, and why we as maternity return coaches believe that this is a pinch point. This is sort of a crux moment, if you like, where it is important to look for support, and why we think the work that we do, does have a real value and a real purpose. Is there anything else that you want to add, Sarah, before we?
No, I think we've got a few blog posts coming this month on this topic, so to keep an eye out for those. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, we're talking about self-care and the value of maternity return coaching as well. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you've got any questions, please feel free to be in touch with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.